SARC Talk. SARC is a nonprofit cancer research organization that develops and manages clinical research trials in pediatric and adult sarcomas. SARC Talk is a podcast to discuss activities of SARC, interview sarcoma research leaders, and review scientific initiatives in the sarcoma field.
Welcome to SARC Talk, episode 39. My name is Scott Okuno, a medical oncologist at Mayo Clinic and Chief Medical Officer of SARC. At SARC Talk, we interview interesting people who are connected to sarcoma, where we can all share and spread the knowledge about sarcoma. All episodes are posted on our website, Spotify, YouTube, SARC channel, or wherever podcasts are available. Please subscribe and submit any comments as we do look at them. Today, our guest is Daphne Edgren. Daphne brings a really unique perspective, blending a background of fine arts with a career in oncology research and medical writing. She earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and is currently pursuing a master's in public health at Harvard University. She currently works as a senior medical writer at Northwestern University, and we'll learn more about that. She focuses on sarcoma, neuro-oncology, as well as pediatric oncology. Daphne is also a creator of our new podcast in conjunction with SARC that is called Rise to Face the Sun, the Patient Experience. Welcome, Daphne.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
We're flipping roles now because you've been actively involved in the podcasting at this time. But maybe you can share with our audience, you started in the fine arts. Can you walk through how you got involved in a career in medical writing and what is medical writing and how did that translate into public health?
Yeah. So I'll kind of go back to when I was going to start college, because that's where it all really actually started, because I did my undergrad, like you said, in fine arts. And what basically happened was like a spark interest in medicine, because before the age of 18, I had been creating art pretty prolifically since I was making memories. We even had an art room in my house, because that's how much art my sister and I would produce. And so I moved to Chicago to go to School of the Arts to Chicago, which we can also just call SAIC. And within that first week of getting here, because now I'm in Chicago, I was diagnosed with acute respiratory distress syndrome, also known as ARDS. And within, I think it was the day after I got to the hospital, I was put on ECMO, I was intubated, I was on the lung transplant list, I was put into an medically induced coma, and I had a 2% chance of survival, that 2% being if I were to survive, they were assuming I'd have brain damage. And so I remember them waking me up from my coma, and there's a lot of conversations happening around me that I didn't really understand. But one of the things they wanted to do was something that was still relatively new. This is in 2014, which is they wanted me to walk on ECMO to try to help awaken my lungs. And so I walked on ECMO. I was the first patient at Northwestern and in Illinois to walk on ECMO. And I remember seeing all the Northwestern medical students watching me. I remember thinking I don't get what the big deal is, but now I do. But at the time I just didn't really understand. And I think it was really that moment that actually helped awaken my lungs. And something else I left that hospital with was the team was so kind and compassionate. And it was a type of, and when I mean care, I'm not meaning in the sense of they're, giving me bandages and giving me ECMO and all that stuff. I mean the care and how they would look at me and how they would talk to me and how they treated me and all that. I had never felt that before. And I remember just thinking, I was discharged from the hospital. And even though I was this artist I had a half ride to SAIC, I had a grant to study in Italy. I had all these things that SAIC had given me because I was such a prolific artist. And all I could think was, I want to get back into that hospital. And so what I did is for the main key players in my recovery and treatment at Northwestern in arts, I made each of them an art piece. as like a thank you, but also as like kind of a way to get back in. So I went back in and I went to the ICU, at least one of them that I stayed in, and I gave each of these people the like art piece I'd created. And I was very confident. And I walked up to one of the doctors who had treated me and I said, look, like full disclosure, like I'm an artist. Like I didn't pay attention really in science classes. Like I go to an art conservatory. So I just want to be very clear about that. But my mom told me I have to find a job here during the summer if I want to stay in Chicago. And I don't know anything about this. Is there like anything I can do? Like, I don't care what it is. Like, is there something I can do? I just want to be in the hospital. And he said to me, well, you could be a research assistant in my wet lab. Don't worry. You don't need to know any science. And I remember thinking, yeah, right. Like, don't need to know any science. But I still said yes. I was like, oh, absolutely. And I actually did really well. I did RNA isolation and qPCR and cell culture. And I even went back the following summer. And I started doing medical illustration and doing operating room cinematography. And so the art kind of came in naturally. But something that I actually learned about myself at that point, and actually in research coordinator roles I had later on, and now as a medical writer, the thing is at least for me, I think very visually, and I don't learn from textbooks the way that like other people do. So when I was like in that lab and in future labs, I actually taught myself. I bought a biology textbook. I bought Gray's Anatomy and I actually read through it because I just was like, I don't know what I need to know, so I might as well read this. And I started drawing like all the cell biology and stuff and doing different arrows and stuff because I thought if I can make this like a moving image in my head, because I graduated the School of the University of Chicago with an emphasis in cinematography. If I could see the way these things move, then it helps me learn, like in these visual moving frameworks. And so that was like a skill that art taught me that I didn't really realize until later on. So overall, like I never really decided to go into research, I guess. It kind of I just continued to do it. And it was art informed the science for me, which is why like I kept doing it. And so that's what led me here to being a senior medical writer. And I should say like everything I share today is like my own, perspective and experience. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Northwestern or any institution, but medical writing is a big chapter in that journey and my journey to research through like a non-traditional background and then pursuing my master's of public health alongside it. And I've learned that to continue research, you should understand the bigger landscape before you know which like smaller problems to focus on first. And so one of those is being sarcoma.
Well, Daphne, thanks for sharing. And I assume you're fully recovered from your acute respiratory distress, the walking ECMO. You're kind of a legend there, it sounds like, in that unit there. But that kind of changed your trajectory, is what we're hearing.
Yeah, no, it did. And initially it was that I liked the people. Like it doesn't really get more interesting. Like it doesn't get more interesting than that. I just really liked the people. And then I saw what people were doing like in the labs and stuff. And I was like, wow, like this is so cool. Cause it's like, they're actually going to put this into the clinic. And I just found that just so, intriguing and exciting. And I think it was also so different from art stuff I'd been doing for so long that I think that's also what really captured me.
So the path is a little bit, and a lot of what we do on SARC Talk is talk about career paths. And clearly you thought the plan or someone's plan was to be an artist. However, you spend some time after an illness working in the wet lab, doing real research, doing things. The part that you and I have shared before is then how did that translate in becoming a medical writer? Because medical writing is something that's unique, and I don't think all institutions have that. And maybe you can share a little bit of the transition from being in the lab research to doing medical writing. That would be helpful.
Well, first I'll say going from the lab to medical writing, there's like many years in between. So I'd say like it kind of slowly built up to where I was like this research assistant in the wet lab. And then honestly, I applied for a clinical research assistant position that I got because I wanted to just know more about medicine. And I started to learn, if I apply for jobs and I just get them, then I'll learn. And that's what happened. And then I ended up becoming a coordinator, and then a coordinator 2, and then finally became a senior coordinator, and then a medical writer. And being a medical writer in oncology, I also didn't know it was a thing. I actually applied for a different job, and I remember they said, "Hey, you'd be really good as a medical writer." And I just thought, like, "Oh, I trust you. Like, that's great. I hope so." And it turns out I am, because now I'm a senior after a year and a half of working there. But what makes medical writing really difficult in oncology is we are limited. There's not like a bunch of medical writers. We have 4 right now, which is usually the number we have. But you don't just get to write about one type of, cancer. Like, you write about multiple. So I'm lead for sarcoma, neuro-oncology, pediatric oncology, and pediatric oncology then is its own bubble. So there's hematology oncology and then neuro-oncology within pediatrics, just for what we're doing. And then I'm writing another one on like bladder, another one on liver. I have one for breast. So there's a lot of different ones. I just happen to have all the ones for the sarcoma, neuro, and then peds. But I'd say, how does it like translate? I think with the wet lab research I did, I think that was just my initial taste of it. But I think mostly it was really actually the art that kind of flowed all the way through it. If I think about all of my experiences as like isolated experiences, the thread that holds them together for me is actually the fine arts. So that's kind of how I perceive it.
Then gets the question is you eventually graduated from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Clearly you learned some skill sets there above and beyond wet lab, because I don't think they taught you wet lab at the
No,
Art Institute there. But how did that training or the education that you received at the Art Institute, you talk about it, that theme, and how does that still influence your work today?
That's a good question. So first off, I'll talk a lot about like what the teaching style is at SAIC, because I think outside of art, people don't know. And I learned that by talking to people who actually went to a traditional university. That the art school is very different. So first, I'll say different art schools have different approaches. So, for example, Rhode Island School of Design, also known as RISD, is complete opposite of SAIC. Their approach is, we want to teach you the technique, and then like I think it's your 4th year, you learn like concepts or how to think conceptually and put concepts into your work, which is very important in art. SAIC has a very different approach where they believe that technique can be easily taught. It's really how to think conceptually that's a lot harder. And so I think actually the main thing that SAIC taught me was learn how to learn. And in our studio and like art history classes, what we would do on a regular basis, all the times we would spend analyzing artwork. And so you would sit and you would stare at a drawing or painting or like video, and you would like ask, what does this mean to me? What would this mean to other people? What do I see? And what's really interesting is that then you'd go around the room and learn everybody has a different interpretation of it. And you'd realize that something as small as like the way the light is hitting maybe just a painting and the way the shadow reflects off of the frame can actually completely change people's perception of what the concept is. And the thing is that you also learn that we process things so fast that like we know what our we have like intuitions that we arrive at, but in a millisecond, like our brain like rationalizes them, and it's really trying to get to that. What is your initial reaction and intuition around that? And so this will all tie back, but another part of this is they allow you to experiment with a lot of different types of art. So I worked in woodworking, different kinds of sculpture, painting, etching, hand-drawn animation, cinematography. The list goes on. And you have to switch between them so rapidly that you had to ask yourself, in order to do this art style, what can I draw from other mediums that applies here? And so you had to be very methodical about like what transfers and what doesn't. And so that rapid like context switching across all these different domains built, like I'd call it almost like a nimbleness that like I use constantly now. So now going back to medical writing and switching between like pediatric oncology protocols to neuro-onc, sarcoma, and so on, you have very different tumor types, very different patient population. The correlatives are different. Like obviously the backgrounds are different. The personalities are different. And so being able to fluidly like context switch on a daily basis is what I learned personally for me for art school. And there's something else that I've thought about this before, and I hope it lands, but something that I think is really interesting. This is an example, and I'm going to connect it to sarcoma, is that like there's this thing that people love, and it's realism. Like I think people get just so infatuated with like realism. It's like, wow, how could someone paint something or draw something so exact to how I see it? And so it's very faithful to the human eye, and it's like one perspective. And then there's like cubism, where you completely abandon like that single perspective, and instead you show all these like multiple angles like simultaneously. And it's very disorienting because you're seeing something from several viewpoints at once, but it reveals like a complexity that realism can't really capture. And so then that's how I actually got interested in sarcoma, because I initially didn't know what it was when I became a medical writer. And what I like about it, and I find it really intriguing, is that you can't approach it with that like realism framework. It's not like a site of origin, one size fits all sort of approach. It breaks those traditional like boundaries. And so you kind of have to think in cubism terms and hold all these multiple perspectives at once, where you have to look at the tumor microenvironment and spatial organization and cytokine niches and so on. And you have to see all of it simultaneously to understand how all these variables interact. And so the piece that's kind of like holding it all together that finally brought me to medical writing and then really sarcoma is that art school taught me that like breaking traditional frameworks is genuinely how you solve complex problems. And so that's kind of how I see it.
It's interesting because you're using things that we probably learned in undergrad or things, but I don't think I've ever been at a sarcoma meeting where we talked about Cubanism. I can tell you that right now. So,
Sure.
but you start to think about how we see the world, and the traditional stuff that we typically use in solid tumor might not be the same as we're thinking about now as we develop this concept in sarcomas, and then that kind of attracted you to be a medical writer and do that at Northwestern. And maybe you can share how specifically you got involved and kind of what is your relationship with the sarcoma team at Northwestern as you're developing the medical writing. And for those that are listening on podcasts, don't worry, that was a pager. We'll take care of that. So don't worry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So my timeline is it was medical writing and then it was sarcoma. And so I'll explain that first. So when I initially got this medical writing role, I specifically said, I want to do pediatric oncology and I want to do neuro-oncology. As I had previously worked as a coordinator in neurology and then also in pediatrics separately. And I also just love kids. So that was part of it. And so they said, yeah, that's fine. But we're also going to give you a couple protocols in sarcoma. And I was like, what's that? And I was working on, it didn't happen simultaneously, but I remember I worked on two protocols for the sarcoma PIs. And of course, my boss is still training me at that point. So she has to be at these meetings. And she says to me afterwards, wow, you get along with them really well. And I just thought, thank you, I do. And so, and it kind of brought me back to this memory I had where I was working as was it a coordinator? I was over at Columbia University in New York, and I was working for chief of anesthesiology. And I, at one point, wanted to be an MD, and I decided not to go down that route for certain reasons. But I said to him, I want to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he was like, no, you don't. And I was just like, what? And he was like, no, you don't have the personality for it. And he was kind of explained to me, well, why. And I just thought, oh, I don't have the personality for it. And then it kind of crushed me a little bit because I was like, man, do I have to have a specific personality to work in a certain area of medicine? So I remembered that. And as I was talking to these sarcoma specialists, and I just thought, well, that's cool. I really do get along. Not that I didn't get along with other people, but I was like, I genuinely get along with these people. And so it first started there. And I remember I started working on a very specific protocol with Dr. Pollock. And he sent me the concept. What we do is we take a concept that a PI writes, and it can be as thorough or as not thorough as they have, but we take it and then we basically turn it into a protocol. And so he was really excited about this one that just opened. And it's basically they're using this IL-15 superantagonist in patients who have previously received TCR engineered T cells, but now they've become exhausted. And so we want to see if this basically helps. And so I had written that protocol with him, and I basically got more and more interested to where as part of my Master's of Public Health, I have to do a practicum, which is like a fancy word for a big, meaningful public health project. And so I went to him and I was just like, hey, I like what you're doing. Very curious, like, how are you thinking of taking the direction of, the sarcoma program at Northwestern? And he was like, well, we just basically want to continue to do research and try to find treatments for patients. I think it was something like that. But then he's like, you should get involved with SARC. And I was like, what's that? And so I found out what SARC is. And that's kind of how I got connected with you all. But the other things I'm doing with them is really just we're writing protocols. Dr. Pollock and I get along pretty well. So he's asked me to help with, certain papers and stuff. And now like the actual literal art piece is coming back with like help with figure design and medical illustration and all of that. But that's where we're at now. So we're pretty close, I'd say.
You're very fortunate, and we're all fortunate to be around people that might change your life. And, working with Seth Pollock and the sarcoma team at Northwestern kind of got you here. I mean, there are many streets that you could have got here, but now you're here, which we're blessed to have. And you've done some marvelous work doing podcasts. That's the Rise to Face the Sun, the patient experience. And maybe you can share, like, even though the introduction was made with Seth to come and, work with some of the team members here at SARC, kind of tell the group here that's listening, Rise to Face the Sun, the patient experience, and how you got involved with this project and how did it start?
Basically, so I've been doing research for a while now, and I think my ultimate goal is to contribute to finding new treatments in sarcoma. I know for sure, as working in multiple areas in medicine, I know sarcoma is where I belong. But I think like big picture, this is how I think I tend to work backwards a bit, is I think we need to, I think I've said this before, like understand the bigger problems before we start focusing on the smaller problems. And I think the people who are at the forefront of sarcoma are the people who have sarcoma themselves. And so one thing that I don't get as a medical writer is patient-facing experience. I got that as a coordinator, and I really liked it, mainly because I like talking to people. But I also wanted to understand, I'm writing these protocols, and it becomes very technical to where you're focusing so much on, certain details that, for example, people with sarcoma, patients, they have no idea even exist. And so I wanted to talk to them to kind of get a much better idea of what they're going through. Because if I'm going to be writing the protocol, I'm very curious to know what's happening on the other side of something like this, even if it's not a protocol that's actually taken effect yet. And so I think, like, not sure if this is just me, but I'm sure there's like this assumption that like expertise only comes from like MDs and PhDs and years of research. But, people with sarcoma patients have a real type of experience, and it's they know what that experience like actually feels like, with like the short term and like long term effects, and like what happens to them socially and what, doesn't happen to them socially. And so beyond like the clinical, they teach you something about like how to engage with people as full human beings, not just like in the clinic, which I knew as like a coordinator when I was seeing people as patients in the clinic. I knew that was not just them, but it's hard because you don't visually see them outside of the clinic. And like, especially these age ranges, because this podcast focuses on adolescents and young adults, they're at like the peak of their like life where they're going to begin their career, and like everything they've worked for is about to take off, and then they get hit with something so rare, something doesn't have a lot of treatments, something doesn't have like as much support online as maybe some other diseases. And so basically, I just was thinking, if I'm going to be really pursuing sarcoma research, I need to be listening to these patients first. And also on top of that, I think it was really surprising to me. I know it's very rare, but there's very little awareness around sarcoma. If you start going into something like Instagram, which is where like social media is a lot where these patients find each other, there is a whole like ecosystem of like these patients from all around the world who are like trying to talk to each other, like, oh, I've got this sarcoma subtype, what do you have, and this and that, and they connect over that. But there is time that they spend trying to connect with those people. There's not immediate support groups if you're just like, I don't know, like in Ohio or, in Virginia or something like that. I'm just picking random states. But there's not just like an immediate support group you can go to. What I found is that there are these support groups that are like kind of online. And so, in trying to figure out, what the patients were feeling in all of this, I think I connected with it a lot. And I wanted to bring awareness to it because I have not had cancer, and no one in my family's had cancer. And like, so I don't really have like that personal experience to it. But I remember like hearing about it from actually one of Dr. Pollack's talks at Northwestern. And I remember thinking, there's such little awareness and support around this. What would it be like to get a cancer like this at that age and like be so lonely? Because all I could remember was, going back to my own experience, I remember I'd not met, and to this day I still have not met, someone my age who had ARDS, and that was only, but I recovered. So I was just thinking, how would somebody in these shoes that affects their life all the way down the road, how do they feel? So I think creating a podcast is a support system in and of itself, because if people get diagnosed, at least while they're trying to do the digging and trying to find people to actually talk to, they can actually go online, immediately see that there's a podcast that's dedicated to just sarcoma. And that's just not a thing yet.
It's interesting. You brought up the point that the human contact that you had as a clinical research associate, research protocol person, is something that you might miss and don't really get when you're purely writing protocols as a medical writer. But somewhere along the way, you wanted to merge the medical writing, the research with the voice of a patient who in this AYA group, and maybe you can describe that a little bit more, is there's a different support system that they have or don't have that may be someone who is really young or someone who is an adult age with kids and family have. And this is what you're starting to explore in your podcast. And how does that influence your ability to do research, your ability to be a better medical writer through this process?
Yeah, so we still have a few more episodes to record. So I feel like afterwards and after they're all edited, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna watch them, and like I think there's a lot that's been said that I think is going to inform me then further on. But something in the podcast that patients really emphasized, regardless of like whether their treatment reduced their tumor or like made them disease free, was the doctor patient relationship. And there are many times where they would like light up talking about a doctor who kept checking in on them, who showed genuine care, and I've heard stories that like go deeper than that. But there's just one where this one patient actually decided to forego the recommended treatment because she just like, I remember her telling me she tried it once and she just had this gut intuition that I can't do this. And so what she decided to do is she chose a different route that was offered to her, but was told this is not the ideal one. You should do the other one instead. She went with this route and she added on complementary treatments that she wanted. So there were things like Reiki and meditation, and she kind of had these, what we kind of call like alternative treatments, but she called them complementary. Her provider was all informed on all of this. And the provider gave her the information as to like what the risks were of this. But what she said is, but she didn't like heavily push back because it was ultimately like her decision. And so they really she felt like her autonomy was very respected and that like trusted to make her own choice. And so, that really strengthens like the doctor and like patient relationship. And what's interesting is that she's now in remission. And I think that kind of trust and being heard and having your autonomy like respected, even when like your provider disagrees, or maybe that's not something that the provider would choose, something like that. Not that they end up saying that or they shouldn't, but like I believe that's like clinically meaningful. And so if it affects how someone engages with their care and how much they trust their team and how they experience like that whole process. And so how that translates into research and protocols, of course, like sarcoma has like limited resources, and I'm hoping that changes. But, the shared decision making is, I think, extra complex because there is this lack of resources. And so what I'm noticing is that the patients, I mean, this might already be a given to people who practice medicine, but I've heard so much like they really need the feeling to be autonomous and trusted and not just informed. And they felt like that genuinely affected their quality of life, which was another thing I heard a lot. Was a lot of people, they understood like what was going on and that like survival was not guaranteed by any means. So they really focus on quality of life, and what adds to that quality of life is the physician. And so like baking that into, protocols and so on. I mean, you're also responsible for like safety check-ins or like coordinator calls and like thinking about a little bit outside the box about like, when you are designing like a study procedures table, like how is this going to feel for a patient? For example, I was working on one with Dr. Pollock, and because patients with the type of sarcoma that we were doing a protocol on were so rare, they were coming from outside the state or outside the country. But what the treatment required was for them to come in every 2 weeks. And if you're thinking about people of this age of like, what is it, the 15 to 39, coming in every 2 weeks to receive treatment, like how does that affect their life and how are they able to do that? So we ended up coming up with like a travel reimbursement amount. We changed a couple things to try to make it a little bit easier. But So that's kind of how it's incorporated, is that you really have to think about how the patient's going to experience this, because then also it's going to affect how your research is going to work, and then if you're even going to get the results that, I want to say the results you hope to get, but at least the correlatives and all the information that you hope to get in order to do like analyses at the very end.
You started this project as a connection that Dr. Pollack said, hey, you should get involved with SARC. You're using a lot of skills in interviewing. You're doing skills in editing, putting together the story of the patients in the AYA group. You've shared that there are some emotional and social context stories that really affected you. And can you tell us a little bit more? Was that a surprise that you had when you started this? Because it didn't sound like this was something that you originally anticipated would be some of the stories that you were going to do a podcast with family members of loved ones and the AYA group.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of things I was thinking about before I started the podcast, and I think it wasn't that I didn't consider that it would be emotional. It's just I think I was thinking through so many logistics that it was just something that didn't end up coming to mind. And yeah, it ended up being, there's some very emotional stories. There's some people who have are their sarcoma journey was like 10 years ago, sort of thing. So those conversations are different. But then I interviewed a mom who lost her daughter now about 7 months ago. And so obviously that story is really different. What I found really surprising is, I think, in like everyday conversation, especially like in the English language, it's very, there's not very many words to describe emotions. Like we talk about how things are hard or things are sad or things are difficult. And I think what I learned when I was like doing these podcasts is, when people would say, they didn't say this was very difficult or this was incredibly hard or things like that. A lot of times people just said, yeah, this was hard. And that made me realize we use that word way too much for context it doesn't belong in. Like so that was something I found very interesting. And another thing that was it wasn't emotional till later on. And I'll explain kind of what my thinking was. What happened is, throughout all these interviews, I ask at the very end, like, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's like recently diagnosed, or whose family member has been diagnosed, or so on, especially in this age where like people are trying to have a career and trying to finance themselves, and like, are the ones that like their family is depending on because they're their age 30, 35, so on. And they don't really fit they don't fit the children's hospital, but they don't fit the adults hospital either. So it makes that experience even more lonely. So I was trying to ask, like, what advice would you give? And I'm not kidding. Like, I don't think there was one, I think, that didn't say this. I think every single one said it in some shape or form. You have to continue having hope. You have to have like a light about you. You have to continue to enjoy life, and you have to work hard at being hopeful. And I heard that the first time, and very honestly, I thought, like, is there something more tangible to that? Like, is there something you can tell me that I could literally go and do today that makes me more hopeful? There's no answer to that. You just have to be hopeful. And I think there is a lot more to that, but people kept saying that to me, and it started to sit with me and resonate with me more and more as I was talking to people, because they were saying it different ways, and so I started to understand. It's again, I kind of came into this also as someone who, like, at once was dying, and I felt very lonely, and I just didn't want other people to feel like that same loneliness, and have certain support groups, through this field that I also found very interesting. And I remember these patients actually like revealed something to me, is that, like, in my own experience, I remember there was one day where my lungs weren't getting better. And so they told me like they said it in more clinical terms and they were very soft about it, but they were like, yeah, we think we're not really quite sure this is going. Like, we don't think you're going to get better. And I was like bedridden at this point. And I remember I just flat out like accepted I was going to die. I remember that moment exactly. And so there was like, I just remember there was like absolutely no light. Like, I just remember thinking that's it. And so when I hear these sarcoma patients talking about holding on to hope during these experiences, 18-year-old me really wishes someone had told me that. And so I think these people are doing something that I don't know if it's that I couldn't do, but I definitely didn't do until like afterwards. And so I think through the podcast, that's what I hope people get, is that they hear it, but then they hear it times 10, and then they realize that they actually, like, this is an actual thing that people are talking about, and it does work. And they're hearing it from from survivors. And, we have a couple people who family members have been lost, but most of these people are survivors. So, yeah.
You kind of hit on it that, you might have had a goal at the beginning when you started the 10 episode series. You're getting to the end of these episodes, and you've kind of shared that these people are lonely. They do need support. They do need hope. And this is something that I think all listeners would really need to understand, because in all of what we do, you're going through the journey alone, but you have people around you, but you still feel alone. And this might be an age group that, well, hopefully, as you listen to all 10 episodes, that you'll get some additional awareness, maybe some understanding of what these individuals are going through. But as you are kind of finishing up the episodes, what would be your main hope that our listeners will take away after listening to all 10 episodes?
I hope people actually listen to them outside of the sarcoma community too, because the whole point is I wanted to create awareness around it. And if it's only sarcoma patients listening, then we haven't exactly solved the awareness problem. But I guess at the very least, it's out there, right? Like, you can't really control certain things. At least you can kind of put it out there. But I think for people who do listen, especially those who've just been diagnosed with sarcoma or even another rare cancer, that I'm hoping they actually feel less alone. And I kind of touched on this before, but it's like you kind of have to, it doesn't take too long, but you do kind of have to sift through the social media platforms to find these sarcoma communities. But if there's these, documented, recorded podcasts, people can listen to them over and over again. And we have a lot of different kinds of people that are on there. So you can kind of, find somebody you feel kind of reflects you a little bit more. And that's what I'm hoping. Like, we even have moms on there. So I'm hoping that even moms who have, kids who are of this age group, going through sarcoma are able to go, oh, okay, well, there's a mom talking about this, and it makes me feel a little bit less alone. We have another person. I was so happy for this. He's a gentleman who unfortunately is battling sarcoma for the second time, but something in the sarcoma space is that, and I think cancer in general, but guys don't really talk about their experience a lot because of, I don't know if it's social expectations, but he was telling me he feels like he has to remain strong. And his job was working in construction, and he, and then you get, rare cancer and cancer in general. And then he was like, you feel less than I don't know if he said less than a man or something like that. But he said a lot of guys didn't talk about it. So I felt like I had to be really strong about it. And his message to guys was, you do need to talk about this. and you should reach out for help and support, and you can't do this alone. So I think when people listen to it, I hope they find somebody on there that they can say, okay, at least like this is somebody I kind of connect with, and then they can listen to that episode and get something out of it that is applicable specifically to them. And yeah, that's what I'm hoping people get out of it within the sarcoma community. And then I hope other people listen to it too and start knowing sarcoma exists, but that's what I would say.
You had this great concept of a series, a podcast, interviewing AYA individuals from the patient family perspective. And this is a kind of storytelling that influences a lot of people, not only the people that you're targeting, the AYA group, but as you said, this could be applicable to researchers, to clinicians, to parents, siblings, etc. So as this storytelling unfolds, you and I have shared that there might be another series that might come out of this, as well as the storytelling aspect, because it's not just one individual, it's 10 individuals. And we would encourage all of us to spend some time and almost meditate on each one of these series and think about it the next day or so, do the next one, although we might drop them. But take time to think about it. So can you share a little bit about how you think this storytelling might be supportive of other ways that we can think about patient care and research?
Yes, because the patients themselves did talk a lot about they talked about social aspects, like their family or friends and all of that, but they also talked about healthcare workers and researchers and all of that. And through the podcast, I'm hoping that honestly, healthcare workers, like clinicians, techs, nurses, all of those people and researchers, honestly, I want them to understand how much of a difference they're making in these people's lives, not just through treatment, because sometimes you can't control what things are available. And it's like, you just give, I don't know if it's just, you just give the treatment and you feel like, oh, is that all I'm doing? But it's really how they show up for people. And like I said before, like people light up when they talk about their caregivers. And what I'm noticing as well in these interviews is that, when treatment options are like limited and outcomes are uncertain, like I said, the patient-doctor relationship is like clinically essential. And if there's not already, and I'm sure this is already a very heavy topic conversation amongst teams, but more discussion and more collaboration and trust, it really goes a long way. And it's kind of like the patient I mentioned before who was working with her provider on getting a different type of treatment and working through her complementary treatments. And that, I can't say if that trust actually led to her going into remission or not, but she is in remission. And she talks about her provider very, positively. And then I've talked to other people who are still going through sarcoma, and they talk about their providers very positively and about their quality of life and how the researchers and the doctors kind of what they bring to the table in that respect. And so something I kind of want to acknowledge in saying all this is not everybody has family support, even though like we would expect that there to be a lot of family support, especially in these really severe diseases and cancers. And so for some of these patients, their like healthcare team is their primary support system. So when I say caregivers matter, I'm also I'm really talking about these healthcare workers. So I hope the podcast initiates momentum around investing in sarcoma research. And we're still using and this, but decades old treatment because sarcoma is rare and complex. And we do have immunotherapies coming up that are becoming promising, which is really great. But what is great about sarcoma research that I'm sure I'm not the only one to think about this, but sarcoma research doesn't just help patients with sarcoma. I think the principles we develop for sarcoma apply across, cancers and immunotherapy approaches. And they like ripple outwards. Like we've had different identifications of like, the NY-ESO-1 and how that's like affected, T cell therapies and so on, and in other cancers, and how the relational like principles do too. So how to work with patients when uncertainty is high, and how to honor their autonomy, and how to build like real trust. That's like a sarcoma lesson that I think can even go outside of sarcoma. And I think, kind of to wrap this all up, because it might sound a little tangential, is that I, I hope healthcare workers and researchers, when they listen to the podcast, know and get from it that the patients are really thinking about them a lot, and they're incredibly grateful, even after they're disease free, even if they're not disease free. And I think they don't get thanked enough for the work they're doing, especially with such few resources. But it really matters, and these people who have gone through sarcoma and all that, they fully acknowledge that, and they think about it quite a lot.
Well, it's sobering to know that, because sometimes we don't stop and reflect on that as, providers, that, we are a big impact, and our team might be the major social support that these individuals get. Daphne, as we end here, part of this journey that you've gone through and you shared with our audience is the importance of individuals in your life that kind of change your trajectory, events in your life that change your trajectory. How is this podcast and the time and effort that you've put into this, the conversations you've had recording with family members and patients, kind of affected you, and how have you changed because of it?
Well, I think first off, it definitely solidified that I want to focus in sarcoma. I mean, before I already knew I wanted to, but I think meeting these patients and talking about their experiences solidified any ounce of maybe what ifs that I had. I think also for me, like I had kind of mentioned before, it actually made me kind of reflect on my own experiences a little bit differently, because I personally didn't have certain support systems. So that was interesting for me to have a little bit of an introspective look. And then it also, for me, I think this is more as like a medical writer, but when you're writing things that are so technical, you really are very removed from the patient, like from the patient experience. And uh, really can make changes in the way that you're constructing a protocol, because there's no research if you don't have patients. And so if you actually want to find the new treatments that you want to find, you have to create, your protocols in a way where people are going to want to keep showing up, and people don't always keep showing up just because of the treatments, because there's some people who, they know that it's experimental. They're not at research because, they're at research because nothing else has worked. So they do know the situations they're in. And I think sometimes people continue to show up because of how, the protocols move, or like the clinical trials moving along, but also because of the people that are taking care of them. And so I think for me, I've gotten a lot more insight into like a semblance of what it's like to have and go through a rare cancer. And then also, I just hadn't really thought about it too much before, but I have a tremendous amount of empathy for these, especially AYA patients who, built like their entire career, and then all of a sudden they get this rare cancer diagnosis. They have very little support, very little people to talk to. Even if they do talk to these people, they or get met with, oh, I haven't heard of it, it's probably not one of the bad ones. And just like kind of hearing about the experiences they have, I think I've developed very deep amount of like empathy for these patients. So it's kind of hit me on a few different fronts.
Well, we hope that all of us are touched by the series that you've pulled together, and we appreciate your willingness and capabilities to put together this podcast series, Rise to the Face the Sun, the Patient Experience. For those listening, Daphne, when would the podcast be available?
Yeah, so we're going to release the first 2 episodes of May 29th. So that's going to be the day of the SARC semi-annual meeting before ASCO. And then they're going to release weekly until July 31st. And then that last week, there's going to be 2 more episodes. If I'm doing my math right. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, again, we look forward to seeing and listening to the first 2 that are going to be dropped at a SARC meeting. You'll be at the SARC meeting as well, and we'll be up there sharing this as well to the people there at the meeting at ASCO on that day. So we look forward to that. So we appreciate it. Daphne, any final comments or that you might have as we end here now?
I don't know. Just thank you for allowing me to be on the other side of the podcast. Now I know what it's like to be on the other side. So thank you.
I hope it wasn't painful, but no, we're really excited about this. Some of us had the ability to look at some sneak previews of this, and it's going to be really exciting. I don't want to say exciting, but it's going to be something that will be important as we continue to share experiences of the AYA community, but also trying to spread the awareness of what sarcoma is and the impact that we have on everybody's lives. So we appreciate it. Thanks, Daphne.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. For those that are listening, we look forward to seeing you again in a future SARC talk. Look forward to your comments on the new series, Rise to Face the Sun, the Patient Experience. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to SARC Talk. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more about SARC, visit us at sarctrials.org. If you have questions or would like to suggest a topic, email us at sarctalk@sarctrials.org. SARC Talk is made possible through the generous support of Surier Pharmaceuticals. Together, we can find a cure for all forms of sarcoma.